Thank you very much, Meredith. I got here this morning, maybe like some of the rest of you, not having had my iconic coffee yet, and I said to Meredith, was context my idea or your idea? And she said, oh no, it's she explained it was the global theme, and I thought, well, thank goodness, because it's compared to what I've been talking about for the last couple months, which has to do with affordable housing and job creation and transportation and equity on the south side of Santa Fe. Context seemed really kind of esoteric to me, and I don't know why I would have picked it, but I'm glad we're doing it, because it is a great change of pace, and it puts my brain in a different place, and maybe yours as well. So let me start by telling you a story. It dates back about 27 years. 27 years ago, my partner in crime, Bill Taylor, and I were trying to start Fast Company magazine. We were living in Boston, and we were meeting with people, well, pretty much anybody who'd meet with us, because that's what you do when you're trying to start a business. People will meet with you, and that's a gift. We had a meeting in New York City with a gentleman whose business was venture capital investment in magazines. Now, thinking of context for just 1 minute, fast forward to where we are today and ask yourself whether there is even such a thing today as venture capital investment in magazines, and the answer is probably not. And that's a short definition of context. But back then, there was a guy in New York City whose business was to invest in magazine startups. So we had a meeting with him, and we told him our idea of a magazine that was a cross between the Harvard Business Review and Rolling Stone. And he looked at us and he said, that's a really stupid idea. There is no market for that, but I'm here to help you. He said, I have a great prospect. We're going to start a magazine for moms who have just had their first baby. And we know where they are. We can find them by zip code. We know, because of data, where they gave birth. And we know exactly what products they need as first-time moms, and those are all the advertisers. So when you think about starting a magazine, we've got the target audience, we've got the advertisers, and now all we need is some stuff to put around the advertising. And Bill and I looked at each other and we said, yeah, that's exactly what we want to do. We want to be in the stuff business that goes around the advertising. And we left that meeting, and about a year later, 2 years later, 25 years ago, we launched Fast Company, and this is our premiere issue. And if you probably can't read the cover from there, but what it says is, work is personal, computing is social, knowledge is power, break the rules. That's about as far from putting stuff around advertising as you can get. This cover is all about context. Stuff is all about content. And so my takeaway and my takeaway from this and my theme for this morning is context beats content. And here's why. If you go back to the 90s, the launch of Fast Company, the early days of the web, the mantra was content is king. Content is king. And the reason content is king was that the web, for all intents and purposes, the metaphor for the web was it's a giant pipe. We've got this pipe, and it goes into everybody's home and it lands on their computers, and now we just need stuff to pump through that pipe. We need content. And so for the first few years of the web, people were creating content that had no value, but it was pushing it out onto your desktop, into your computer, nowadays onto your phone or wherever you receive your information. But content, as we, I think, now realize, and as we were trying to prove with Fast Company, content is a commodity. Content is the digital equivalent of pig iron. You know, I grew up in St. Louis, and when I would get up in the morning as a boy at 6:30 in the morning, and you turn on the radio, you'd get the farm report. And the farm report would say, hog bellies are down 1/4 and wheat futures are up 3/4. Those are commodities. They're traded as commodities. Information today, content today, is a commodity. It's really a very low value offer. What do we value? What creates value? Well, what creates value is context. Context asks why. Context seeks to explain what is going on in the world so that we can make sense of it. Context takes this commodity and transforms it into meaning. So think about your own experience either as an employee or as a boss. Either one. Think about it in any organization you've been a part of. Somebody comes to you or you produce a PowerPoint and you put it up and it's got a lot of data. And the data informs the boss or informs you if you are the boss of a bunch of numbers that you're supposed to then do something about. That employee who brought you that data is a very low value employee. That's somebody who is bringing you content. But what you're really paying for is context. And so you ask that employee, why should I care about this? What does it mean? What's the story behind the data? And that's context. That explains what is important. And what you're really willing to pay for as a boss or in the world of magazining aren't the facts anymore. It's not the data anymore. It's what it all means, how to interpret it. And that's one of the reasons why Fast Company took off as a business magazine. We weren't reporting business facts. We weren't even reporting business trends. We were describing the meaning, the why, and the what to do about all of the changes that were going on in the world. One of the things that is contextual today is change. There's no question that what we're living through right now is a period of unbelievably rapid and unpredictable and often unanticipatable change. So we all know that. And when you pick up the newspaper in the morning, you're asking yourself not what happened, but how do I understand what happened? How can I make sense of what happened? And if you track the demise of many magazines and many newspapers, they were fundamentally in the content business. They were not in the context business. And so they went out of business because people already have, quote unquote, the news. The news is 24/7. What's not 24/7 is, how do I make sense of the news? Why is it happening? What's your point of view about why it's happening? Help me understand how I as an individual can organize my mental framework for the news that's going on around me. And the publications that are either surviving or adapting, and I look at the New York Times every morning, it is adapting as quickly as it can so that the publication itself asks why, explains a point of view, and then offers you a conversation with it about how you make sense and give it feedback. And so if you're looking purely as a business model question, which I think as an entrepreneur I'm interested in, the New York Times, magazines of all kinds, Fast Company did this from the get-go, offered different ways to engage in a conversation with them, whether it's on a cruise with their editors or their writers, or a invitation into the space, come into the New York Times and meet our writers and have a discussion, pay a little extra for that, come to a conference and meet the people you're reading about. That creates context, it creates community, it creates conversation, it creates what Creative Mornings are all about from the get-go. And that is providing context by having conversation about change in a community. Now let me switch gears a little bit, and hopefully you're keeping track of the time. I want to leave a reasonable amount of time for you to tell me what you think context means. A number of years ago, after my wife Frances and I had moved to Santa Fe, I wrote a book called Rules of Thumb. And Rules of Thumb is 52 lessons that I learned in my work and professional life, my business life, working in politics in Portland, Oregon, in Washington, D.C. for the Carter administration. At one point I worked for a brilliant man named Ted Levitt, who was the marketing genius of his generation and taught marketing at the Harvard Business School when I was the editor of the Harvard Business Review. And Ted had this wonderful practice of carrying around 3x5 cards in his pocket. And when somebody would say something interesting, or he himself would say something interesting, he would write it down on a 3x5 card and stick it in his jacket. And at the end of the day, he'd take them out of his coat and file them under things to work on. Articles to write, articles to get somebody else to write, things to consult on, things to teach in class. And I started doing that. I adopted that practice from Ted. And about 6 or 7 years ago, I pulled out all my 3x5 cards that I had brought to Santa Fe, looked through them, and came up with 52 rules of thumb that I had learned over 40 years of business, politics, editing, entrepreneurship, and so on. And turned it into this book, which Meredith turned down when I tried to give her a free copy. So proving once again that context is more important than content. But one of my rules of thumb is rule number 16. And rule number 16 says, facts are facts, stories are how we learn. So let me illustrate that point. Let me tell you a couple of stories. Story number one. In 2008, healthcare spending claimed 15.4% of the GDP of the United States. That ranked number one in the world. When it came to child well-being, the United States ranked 20th in the world, behind Greece, Poland, the Czech Republic, among other countries. Those are absolutely true facts. That's content. Now let me tell you another story. In late February of 2007, this article appeared in the Washington Post. A 12-year-old boy named DeMonte Driver died of a toothache in Prince George's County. The article says, a routine $80 tooth extraction might have saved DeMonte if his mother had been insured, if his family hadn't lost its Medicaid, if Medicaid dentists weren't so hard to find, if his mother hadn't been so focused on getting a dentist for his older brother who had 6 rotted teeth. Instead, the bacteria from an abscess in DeMonte's tooth spread to his brain and killed him. In the richest nation in the world, a 12-year-old boy died of a toothache living a few miles from the nation's capital. That's context. Now, pop quiz. How much money did the United States spend as a percentage of GDP in 2008? Anybody remember that number? Okay, 15.4%. That number is going to fade very quickly. But tonight, over dinner, you might very well talk about a 12-year-old boy who died in the shadow of the Capitol from a toothache. Because stories are how we learn. Stories are how we express our values. Stories are how we connect with each other. Stories are about people. They're not about things. Stories are about actions that people take to make a difference. And because stories are how we connect with each other, they're how we make meaning of our lives. They provide context. They provide connections. They provide community. In a business sense, if you wanted to talk about business for a second, they're how we create brands. Brands are stories that we tell. Brands are promises that we make as business people. If you think about Apple, Apple as a brand is a promise that you will have a cool product that is very well designed and fits your needs and will be user-centered as an experience. Nike has a story. Great companies have stories of how they were founded. You think about HP in the garage. Fast Company, when we started it, didn't have a founding story, so I made one up. Because the nice thing about stories is they don't absolutely have to be true literally, they have to be true to the spirit of the story you're telling. So the story I told about Fast Company was that one night, I woke up in the middle of the night, I got up and tripped over a Nike shoebox that was on the floor in my study, knocking my head against my desk, and on the desk was a copy of the Harvard Business Review next to Rolling Stone. And when I came to, I had this brilliant flash of insight that I should start a magazine with the design quality of Nike and the spirit of Rolling Stone and the intelligence of the Harvard Business Review. Now, is that story literally true? History will not record the answer to that question. But the context of that story provides the spirit of Fast Company magazine and the energy and the creativity and to some extent the humor that we approached our work with, and why working at Fast Company was so much fun for our employees and our people, because we wanted it to be both serious and fun. One last story that I'd like to tell you is about the story of another rule of thumb, which is rule number 31, everything communicates. Everything communicates. This dates back to a speaking invitation I had years ago at Baruch College in New York to give a talk on business and communications. And before I could even give a talk, the night before, one of the professors took me out for dinner to welcome me and said, "I've got a problem, maybe you can help me." I said, "What's the problem?" And she said, "We have a young man who comes to class every day." This will contextualize the year this happened. This young man comes to class every day and he wears a do-rag on his head. She said, "Is that a problem?" I said, "Well, it depends. It's a problem if he expects to get a job with Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs, but if he wants to get a job as a cool hunter with a New York City branding agency, that's not a problem. That's an advertisement for his skills and his point of view." What the point is, for me, is that everything communicates. Everything we do communicates. Everything in an office communicates what its values are, what its brand is, what it's trying to do in the world. Fast Company, we had a feature regularly appearing called Job Titles of the Future, because the job title you give yourself communicates how you see your work. I tried to get our art director to relinquish his title of art director and call himself the vice president of look and feel, because that's what he was. You know, the magazine, look at the cover. It's all about look and feel. The paper quality we used was all about look and feel. And very proud of the fact that Fast Company one year won the magazine award nationally for the best designed magazine in the country. And we're a business magazine, not a fashion magazine, not Vanity Fair. We were the best designed magazine in the United States because look and feel communicates even more than the words on paper. My son, who is was born dyslexic, used to have on his telephone answering device a message that said, "Leave your beep after my message." If you want to communicate a sense of humor about being dyslexic, that does a pretty good job. Leave your beep after my message. I thought, Adam, you're better at this than I am. That's brilliant, right? Everything communicates, more so today than ever before, because there's more permission for people to look, feel, act, present themselves in the workplace, in our community, as you wish. You get to be you, that's your brand. So let me wrap up quickly. Why does any of this actually matter? What's the point? Well, I think the point is this. Go back to where I started. We're living through incredibly turbulent times. We're living through a period of unprecedented change. When I said facts are facts, I actually misspoke myself. We don't even know what facts are anymore. We have facts that are made up. We have fake news that is made up. We have things that are formulated to mess with our minds and really scramble our understanding of reality. And in that context, what we're really talking about when we describe context and making meaning isn't just the work of a business or a company or a magazine. What we're really talking about is leadership. One of my other rules of thumb in this book is that leadership is not just about making decisions. If you think back to our former President George W. Bush, he used to call himself the decider-in-chief. And there's a part of that that's true. We expect people in positions of responsibility to make decisions. But more important than making decisions is making meaning, is helping everybody make sense out of a complex world. I describe it in rules of thumb as changing the signal to noise ratio. We have too much noise. That's content. We have a 24/7 pipe of noise that's feeding us data and information. We have information overload. What we lack is the ability to separate the signal from the noise. And that's what context is all about. And ultimately, that's what leadership is about, and it's what citizenship is about. As citizens, we're all called upon to help each other separate the signal from the noise, to decide what really matters to us as a community, as a group of people who are trying to solve problems together and make better decisions together. When we ask our leaders to perform as leaders, whether as business people, elected officials, people in nonprofit, healthcare, doesn't matter. The fundamental request we have is help us make meaning and better meaning out of this incredible fog of content. And that's why context is really much more powerful than content. Thank you. So I think we're pretty much on time, and folks can feel free to offer your interpretation of context. Yeah, if you didn't hear the question or the comment, it was, when you think about creating context, you're really describing the capacity for critical thinking. And we are walking away from critical thinking. I'm going to reinterpret your question or your comment a little bit. Instead of focusing on critical thinking in education, we're really doing something else. We're doing a lot of things that are either test-based, fact over interpretation of fact, regurgitation of fact, and ideology and philosophy, whether it's religious or political or narrow bandwidth. And you're right. I mean, one of the debates we're having in New Mexico right now is what we think the fundamental purpose of education is. And I'll give you one other rule of thumb that I think is the one that dates back to the beginning of Fast Company. The rule of thumb is ask the last question first. And it dates from, we put out a pilot issue before we put out our launch issue. And in that pilot issue, we had an essay called Business as War, written by a Harvard Business School professor who loved strategy. And he wrote this brilliant essay in which he said, how did the United States of America win every battle in the war in Vietnam and lose the war? And the answer he gave was, we didn't ask the last question first. And the last question, if you write a business plan, is what's the point of the exercise? What's our definition of victory? And if you don't have a definition of victory, it's hard to know whether you're winning or losing. or even why you're doing it. And I think that's the problem with education. We're not asking the right question. The question is, what's our definition of victory for our kids and our young people in our educational system? And we've lost context. We're asking them to pass tests, and we're not asking them to think or to engage in critical thinking or to engage with the community. We've walled off schools so they no longer connect to the community at large. And as a consequence, we get outcomes that we don't like because we've started with the wrong question. So I think this is partly a political problem, and elections have consequences. And when we elect people who only want to test, you get a system that focuses on testing. If you elect people who believe in civic engagement, critical thinking, community engagement, experiential learning, education that will promote leadership qualities and citizenship qualities, you reframe the curriculum from the get-go. It's a tough problem. On that happy note, who else has a comment? And what you're describing is context. You know, if without context, you have a very flat picture of the world that you don't understand. It's a famous, reminds me of a famous story about Picasso riding on a train, and this fellow recognizes him on the train and says, "Oh, you're Monsieur Picasso, pardon my French, and you paint these really horrible pictures of women. They don't look like women. Women don't look like that." And Picasso says to the fellow, "You have a picture of your wife?" And, "Oh, of course I do." And he hands the photo to Picasso and says, "My God, she's so flat and black and white." You know, we do so much interpretation with our minds, with our eyes, with our experiences, with what we bring to what we read, to what we do, to the workplace, to how we interpret life. Without those experiences, everything is flat and black and white. And when you look at it through the point of view of context and meaning and experience, education is a very different proposition than can you fill in a test on paper. Now, we do need literacy, we do need mathematical capability, all those things are important. That's table stakes. If you really want engaged citizens, you've got to have context. I think we better not overstay. All right, one last one, then we got to, you always want to stop before people start fleeing in horror. One last comment. Yes, you're very, very nice. What I started out by saying was, this is a nice change of pace because when you're on the campaign trail, you're really granular. You're talking about how are we going to fix Santa Fe's lack of affordable housing and rental housing, and what do we do about a lack of trust in city government, and so, all of which is very important. It's also very different than thinking about a talk about context. So it was, I got a chance to stretch my mind a little bit and go back and revisit some past experiences, the history of Fast Company, which it's fun. It's fun. You're right though, when you think about solving Santa Fe's problems, it's all context. It's all about how people want to live. It's about the history of our community and what we're most proud of and we want to preserve. It's about engaging with people where they are and where they feel their lives are impacted by the city government. So you're absolutely right. Context is everywhere we look. Talking about it in a more abstract way is just a welcome chance to eat a different meal this morning. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.